On the night of September 2nd, 1651, inside the Topkapi Palace, one of the most powerful women in the Ottoman world was hiding in a cramped wooden wardrobe. For nearly 30 years, with a single glance or a handwritten letter from behind a silk curtain, she had ruled an empire spanning 3 continents. But that night, no Janissary army came to her rescue. She was dragged across the cold marble floor, stripped of her gold jewelry, and strangled with a curtain cord in the very room she once dominated. That woman was Kösem Sultan. She had spent her entire life watching the blood of her own family crushed under the ruthless Ottoman laws of succession to preserve the dynasty. Yet in the end, male chroniclers conspired to turn her legacy into a brutal indictment. How did a mother who fought to save her bloodline from Ottoman fratricide become the very threat her own harem decided to erase? This story does not begin with an ordinary palace coup. It begins inside a gilded cage known as the Kafes, where a mother's love was weaponized into the ultimate tool for survival. According to the most popular accounts, the young girl destined to shake the foundations of the entire Ottoman Empire may have been born Anastasia, possibly the daughter of a Greek priest from the Aegean island of Tinos. But the cold truth is that when she was kidnapped by raiders at the age of 13 and sold as a slave through Bosnia, her true name, her childhood, and her identity were systematically erased by the Topkapi harem. This gilded palace was not a sanctuary, it was a brutal arena of survival. Here, a woman's worth was measured solely by the sons she bore. Yet the lives of those very children were dictated by one of the most ruthless succession practices in dynastic history, the practice of royal fratricide. Under this decree, to prevent civil war and secure the throne, the first official act of a newly crowned sultan was to order his eunuchs to strangle all of his brothers with silken cords. To mitigate the sheer bloodshed of these massacres, the dynasty constructed the Kafes, literally meaning the cage. It was a secluded enclave deep within the palace, a gilded prison where young princes were confined for life. They lived cut off from political life, surrounded only by controlled servants, silence, and the constant terror of death. They spent their days in agonizing dread, waiting for either a death sentence or a sudden maddening call to the throne when the reigning sultan died. These years of psychological torment inside the cage shattered the minds and spirits of entire generations of princes before they could ever touch the crown. Upon entering the palace and becoming the favored consort of Sultan Ahmed I, the young captive was given the name Mahpeker, meaning moon-faced, and later Kösem, the leader. She quickly realized that her favored status was not a blessing, but a silent noose tightening around the necks of her young sons. But the danger of Kösem Sultan was not that she was ambitious, it was that she understood the cage. Looking at her innocent children, Kösem understood that in the brutal machinery of Topkapi, she had no alternative. To protect her flesh and blood from a cold death by a silken cord or the slow decay of the Kafes, her maternal love had to abandon all innocence. It had to transform into a sharp, ruthless, incalculating political weapon for survival. The Ottoman family tree was no longer a shield. It was folding back into itself, preparing to become the very gallows that would hang her the moment her only protector fell. On November 22, 1617, Sultan Ahmed I died suddenly of an illness at the age of 27. His death plunged the Ottoman court into an unprecedented crisis, turning the throne into a bloody, vacant seat. Yet it was in this tempest that Kösem's calculated move to alter the succession rules saved her children's lives. Instead of allowing Ahmed's eldest son, Osman, to take the throne, she secured the ascension of Ahmed's mentally unstable half-brother, Mustafa I, establishing a system of agnatic seniority to protect her young sons from the brutal law of fratricide. Through 6 years of political chaos, during which Mustafa was deposed and restored, and Osman II was brutally murdered by the Janissaries, Kösem's 11-year-old son, Murad IV, finally ascended the throne in 1623. Because the Sultan was still a minor, Kösem emerged from the shadows with a title never before granted to a woman in 3 centuries of Ottoman rule, the official regent of the empire. From behind a screen in the imperial council, Kösem appointed grand viziers, directed armies, managed the state treasury, and conducted foreign diplomacy with Western powers. To the impoverished citizens of Constantinople, she became a living saint. She built the Chinili Mosque, distributed hot soup to the hungry, and disguised herself to personally pay off the debts of prisoners. To the poor, she was a savior. To the statesmen, she was the most terrifying shadow behind the throne. She believed her charitable glory and absolute power would protect her children. But on the throne of the Ottoman dynasty, power was never something that could be peacefully shared, not even between a mother and her son. The brilliant light of the regency could not obscure a dark reality. Inside Topkapi Palace, Kösem Sultan was forced to watch the blood of her own family crushed under the ruthless laws of Ottoman succession. Her tragedy was written by the very sons she had spent her life protecting from the fatal silken cord. The first of her sons to claim the throne was Murad IV. As Murad grew into a paranoid and brutal ruler, he resolved to cast off his mother's influence and govern with an iron fist. He banned all interference from the harem, pushed Kösem out of the imperial council, and exiled her to the Old Palace. Yet her greatest agony was not the loss of her authority, but her helplessness as Murad ordered the executions of her other sons, Suleiman and Qasim, to secure his hold on power. Kösem's private letters to the Grand Vizier during this period fractured with anxiety as she described herself as being destroyed by grief and exhaustion over her son's actions. When Murad IV died in 1640, Kösem was left with only one surviving son, Ibrahim. Ibrahim had spent his entire youth locked inside the gilded cage of the Kafes, waiting day after day for a death sentence from his brutal brother. 20 years of psychological torment had left the young prince psychologically damaged, fearful, and unprepared for power. When the statesman arrived at his cell to proclaim him the new sultan, Ibrahim locked his door in terror, convinced they were executioners, forcing Kösem to order Murad's corpse carried to the door to prove to her son that he was finally safe. But the throne could not heal a broken mind. Ibrahim ruled in deep paranoia, abandoning himself to lavish excesses and volatile decisions that drained the state treasury. When the Janissaries rebelled and the capital fell into chaos, the statesmen and clergy backed Kösem into the ultimate political corner. During a tense, hours-long debate with the judge Hanifezad, who demanded Ibrahim's deposition in favor of his 6-year-old son, Mehmed, Kösem was forced to make an unthinkable choice. She gave her official consent to depose her own son to save the dynasty from total ruin. In the summer of 1648, Ibrahim was strangled with a silken cord after Kösem, cornered by statesmen, soldiers, and religious authorities, gave the consent they demanded from her. Kösem believed this merciless sacrifice would secure the throne for her young grandson Mehmed IV and restore peace to the realm. She did not realize, by extinguishing her son's life to protect a 6-year-old child's crown, she was releasing a new generation of wolves right behind her back. Following the death of Ibrahim in 1648, the Ottoman throne was passed to Kösem's 6-year-old grandson, Mehmed IV. By court tradition, the young sultan's biological mother, the young consort Turhan Sultan, was supposed to assume the role of regent, but Kösem, who had stood at the center of imperial rule for 3 decades, resolutely refused to retreat into the shadows. Utilizing her absolute influence over the Janissaries, she bypassed protocol to appoint herself Büyük Valide, the Grand Empress Mother, maintaining her grip on the state treasury from behind the curtain. This decision plunged the Topkapi harem into the most brutal power struggle in its history, a fight for survival between a battle-hardened 62-year-old grandmother and a 22-year-old mother desperately shielding her child. Realizing that Turhan Sultan was quietly building a loyal alliance with the palace eunuchs, Kösem decided to play her final, most merciless card. According to accounts documented by court musicians, she planned to poison Mehmed IV with a poisoned cup of sherbet, intending to depose her stubborn grandson and place a more submissive prince on the throne. But inside Topkapi Palace, loyalty was easily sold and secrets leaked fast. The plot was betrayed to Turhan Sultan just hours before the scheduled execution. On the night of September 2, 1651, a cold wind swept through the marble corridors of Topkapi Palace, carrying the heavy footsteps of armed men led by the chief black eunuch, Suleyman Aga. They violently kicked open the doors of the Grand Empress Mother's chambers. Knowing she was betrayed, a panicked Kösem Sultan hid inside a cramped wooden wardrobe in the corner of her room. But the fate of the woman who had ruled an empire across 3 continents was sealed by a single tragic detail. A piece of her golden silk dress protruded from under the cabinet door. She was dragged out onto the cold marble floor. In a desperate attempt to save herself, Kösem Sultan tossed gold coins onto the floor to distract her assailants. But the men were not deceived. The Albanian guard Bostanji Ali Aga lunged at her, stripping her of her remaining valuables and violently tearing the earrings from her ears, 2 chestnut-sized diamonds, the last wedding gifts given to her by her late husband, Ahmed I. Because using a bowstring on royal blood was forbidden, the young, inexperienced assassins ripped a cord from the heavy window curtains of her own room to use as a death weapon. Kösem resisted with furious strength, biting an assassin's thumb before he struck her forehead, knocking her unconscious. Believing she was dead, they left to notify the young sultan, but the resilient mother miraculously dragged herself up to find a secret passage. The machinery of death, however, offered no second chances. Caught once more, the assassins returned, tightening the curtain cord around her neck until Kösem Sultan drew her final breath, leaving her blood-soaked body on the palace floor.
The brutal death of Kösem Sultan on that September night in 1651 was not merely the end of a single life, but the final hammer blow that sealed the coffin of the Sultanate of Women. The collapse of a figure who had stood firm through 4 imperial reigns triggered a cold, calculated reaction within the male-dominated hierarchy of the Ottoman Empire. The Grand Viziers, statesmen, and religious scholars seized this moment to establish an unwritten, ironclad law. Never again would a woman be permitted to hold the title of official regent or intervene in state affairs from behind the curtain. Even the ultimate victor, the young Turhan Sultan, understood the ruthless limits of this system. After serving as regent for a few years, she voluntarily relinquished all executive power to Grand Vizier Köprülü Mehmed Pasha in 1656 and withdrew into the shadows of the harem, officially bringing a century of female sovereignty to a close. Yet the most merciless punishment the world inflicted on Kösem Sultan was not the blood-soaked palace coup, but what the male chroniclers of the 17th and 18th centuries did to her memory. They did not erase her name from the annals of history, for her influence was too immense to deny. Instead, they did something far more insidious. They preserved her name, but rewrote her legacy as a paranoid, power-hungry monster, using her story as a cautionary tale to warn future generations of women that power was a dangerous domain they must never enter. Her massive charitable works, the soup kitchens that fed the starving, and the desperate maternal love she used to protect her sons from the laws of fratricide were buried in the dark, replaced by the legend of a ruthless tyrant. Looking back at the ruins of Kösem Sultan's life through the tragic lens of crown and shadow, the deepest tragedy of the most powerful woman in Eastern history was not her personal ambition, but the cage she was forced to live inside.
Born into violence and raised under the terrifying threat of royal fratricide, her maternal love was forced by the machinery of Topkapi to abandon all innocence and learn the brutal language of survival. She sacrificed her own children to keep the dynasty standing, only to be cast aside by that very empire without mercy. In the end, the crown did not protect her, it only made the silence louder.